the inner world. In my vision, I was in a jungle. I was in this sort of beautiful South American jungle, and there was this fantastic, beautiful woman, black woman with feathers in her hair, the most gorgeous and fabulous goddess. And she came over to me, and then she started to defecate on me. She started to basically shit out all of the bad things, all of the times I've ever been mean, all of the times I've ever not stood up for people, including myself, all of the shame that I had in my life at that stage, you know. And just being a human, that's kind of stuff that we carry with us. I do, I imagine other people do. But had someone pulled me out of that experience at the moment when the shit got real, as it were, I might have found myself at the other end of the experience going, oh, actually, I've come out of this feeling really bad and unresolved, and there's no catharsis and so on.
Tonight, we explore psychedelics. Getting Higher is a manual for exploring the use of psychedelic substances in the context of spirituality, self-transformation, and magic. This is the Psychonauts Essential Guide. Julian Vayne is the author, and he is my guest tonight, and he's coming right up after this on My Alien Life. My Alien Life is recorded live from atop the Northern Rocky Mountains and is available on Spotify, Stitcher, iTunes, and everywhere fine podcasts are found. My website is at www.myalienlifepodcast.com. There you will find my email address, all previously recorded shows, and more. I am Cameron Brower. This is My Alien Life, and the podcast starts right now.
My Alien Life Podcast.
Three, two, 1, 0, 0, and liftoff.
Julian Vayne is an occultist and the author of numerous books, essays, journals, and articles in both the academic and esoteric press. He is an author with over 3 decades of experience in engaging with and writing about esoteric culture, from Druidry to American shamanism, Freemasonry, and Wicca. He is the author of Getting Higher, a manual for exploring the use of psychedelic substances in the context of spirituality, self-transformation, and magic. Tonight we're going to talk about psychedelic substances for those of us who know little or nothing about the experience. Julian Vayne, thank you so much for joining me and welcome.
Thank you very much for inviting me onto the show, Cam.
I know many of my listeners look into the occult and hear the word esoteric and think of that as kind of an exclusionary word, and they may feel they aren't even qualified to begin to study consciousness beyond maybe a 9-to-5 job and exhaustion. What do you tell people like that now?
Oh, that's really interesting. Quite a big sort of statement. I would say that altered states of awareness, however they are arrived at, whether those come to us through the use of psychedelic substances, drugs of one form or another, or whether they are induced by spontaneous experiences, visionary encounters, let's call them, or whether or not they are things that emerge kind of endogenously within ourselves, where we do things like practices such as meditation, or trance drumming or music or any of these kinds of practices. So those states of awareness are part of our inherent human birthright. And as I think is becoming increasingly clear, those states of awareness are really important for our health and our well-being, both as individuals, as societies, and also perhaps as a whole species. So those of us who find ourselves up against the proverbial grindstone of the day-to-day experience, man, I understand that. You know, that's a story for a lot of people. Those of us in the industrial and post-industrial world, and those people who are in perhaps even more challenging kind of circumstances in other contexts or other kind of socioeconomic groups. But I think that an engagement with those altered states of awareness, let's broadly call them that, are really, really important for, as I said, our well-being as individuals and also kind of collectively. So I think having an understanding of those things, what they mean culturally and what they mean for us as individuals, is a really important thing.
It's so easy to get stuck in a rut and we become, dregs of society. So what do you think is the easiest way to get out of that? And what's the next easiest step of consciousness in order to kind of retool and reset every day?
Okay, so let's take a step back. You use the expression there, being in a rut. We're all familiar with this idea, and I'd like to just talk a little bit about an experience that I had earlier on this year, where I was in Britain, in London, taking part in a medical trial using psilocybin. So psilocybin is the primary active constituent of what people probably know as things like magic mushrooms, psychedelic mushrooms. And the trial that I was a participant in was a trial to address treatment-resistant depression, because psychedelic substances can be used to interrupt depression, anxiety, things like post-traumatic stress disorder. And many of these conditions are about being in a rut. Yeah, so if you take the example of somebody who has post-traumatic illness, what typically happens to those people, and what happens to many of us just with the experience of being human, is that we find ourselves going round and round and round in circles. We get into a rut. We have a series of intrusive thoughts that continually arise within us. So someone with post-traumatic stress disorder, whether they have that as a result of being a military veteran, from being in one of the healthcare services, being a firefighter, or someone who's gone through some terrible and unpleasant, abusive or other situation, what happens to them is that their mind gets stuck in a rut. They get stuck in this one way of thinking, and they often think about themselves primarily as a person with depression or a person with this illness. Now, what I experienced as part of this piece of research in January, which was licensed medical research happening in a major hospital in the centre of London, was what a lot of people have experienced with psychedelics, and the reason that they're being increasingly looked at medically. And it's simply that it gets you out of the rut. So what happens with a psychedelic is that we find ourselves in a new state of awareness, where instead of being, to use the following with the same kind of analogy, rather than being trapped in this rut, being unable to see what's beyond it, we find ourselves in a radically different state of consciousness where we can see what's going on as though from a new vantage point. If we were talking in more mythological or shamanic terms, we could talk about it being from a sort of metaphorical point of view, the way that the shaman flies above the landscape. So we look down on our problems. We're no longer absorbed by them. Doesn't mean we're disconnected from them. Doesn't mean that they kind of don't exist. The past is still the past and bad stuff is still bad stuff. But it gives us a new perspective. And when we're down in the rut, we don't have perspective. That's basically the kind of the definition of it, really, in some ways, where we're in this channel, we're in this chasm, we're in this abyss where we can't see beyond that. And my experience, certainly with the psilocybin research, which is the reason that the folks are kind of doing this in the United States, in across Europe, is that we know that what the psychedelic experience allows you to do is to kind of step outside of this rut. Now, any visionary experience will do that. Any radical change in awareness will do that. However it's induced, whether it's chemical or whether it arises in some other way. But having that opportunity to step outside of the kind of your own personal psychological status quo means that you can address things that were problematic in a really powerful way. So I was a research participant. I don't suffer from clinical depression, so I was a quote normal research participant to look at how this medication might be deployed. But it's already being used in some places, and it will be being increasingly used because the psychedelic state is a very, very effective way to break out of that rut.
good example. I think that so many of us, and including myself, we spend so much time also worrying about the past and present. I see this as a problem. Is there a way to alter our state where we actually become present to current events and what's happening around us at the moment?
Yeah. I mean, it's a really good point, and it kind of there's a lot of relationship between that and I mean, when I talk about the psychedelic state, I'm talking in some respects because of my own interest. I'm interested in various ways of inducing that, some of which are chemicals, some of which are through other practices. So meditation, for example, induces an altered state of awareness where it's about being present in the moment. And what happens in our brains is that, and this is kind of quite sort of contemporary neurological language, but it's all kind of checkable through fairly, very mainstream sources. So we have a system in our brain, a functional relationship of bits in our brain, which is called the default mode network. Okay, so the default mode network is the state of the brain that's active as the default when you are not doing anything. So it's sometimes called the task null network. So it's the thing that happens when you're kind of sitting around and you're musing about the future and you're ruminating on the past. You're not, maybe you're thinking about your relationships with other people, but you're not talking to them. You're not doing anything. Yeah. So this is kind of like, there you are, sat on the subway train, or you're kind of just gazing out the window, and the mind is folding back on itself, and we're thinking usually about our own kind of ego identity relationship with other people and the past and the future. Things that maybe we regret or that we would like to have changed, and things that we're planning for what happens next. So this is the default mode network state. And this is perfectly normal. This is what human beings do. This is one of the kind of the mental states that we have. We also have a state which is it goes by various names, but let's, for the purposes of the exercise, call it the present in the now network. Yeah, let's call it that for the purposes of the exercise. And what happens in that state is that that's a state of mind where we are deeply involved in tasks. So, for example, we're in a flow state. Let's imagine you're a musician and you're playing and it's all just kind of going beautifully and it's all happening. That's being involved in a task where the flow state arises. And the default mode network, at that point, your sense of ego identity turns down. Okay, so it's like turning down the light on a dimmer switch. So various things happen. You get time dilation. So you get things like people go, oh, wow, I had no idea that 3 hours has passed, and it only felt like 10 minutes. Yeah, this is a common experience because we're in the now. We're in this kind of present moment. We're not sectioning the kind of the past and the present and the future and the relationship between those things. So our sense of time dilates, it changes. What also happens is that new connections are often made within the mind. So kind of ideas will pop up, and people see this. This is a common human experience. While you're busy engaged in a task, but a task that is perhaps something like, I don't know, cleaning your house, something like this. It gives you the opportunity for these other novel connections to arise, which don't arise so easily in the default mode network state. So if you look at a piece of research that was done in, I think it was 2014, which was done at Imperial College in London, funded partly by the Beckley Foundation. Again, another piece of research with looking at psilocybin. You can, and if people want to go and check this online, it's very easily found. 2014 psilocybin brain imaging study. Try Googling that. And what you'll see is a model of a brain with a default mode network. And it's like looking at a landscape with certain pathways on it. In some respects, these might be thought of as ruts. Yeah. So these are the normal pathways that we have when we're not really doing anything. We're just thinking about ourselves and our relationships with the past and future. When you induce an altered state of awareness, a kind of present in the now state of awareness, whether you do that through dance, drumming, spontaneous visionary encounter, psychedelic drugs, it kind of doesn't really matter, or even being involved in a flow state, so you're a musician or you're involved in perhaps some kind of sporting activity and you're deeply in the flow, a couple of things happen. Firstly, you lose your sense of time. Secondly, what happens is that you get this process that I alluded to earlier where novel connections start to be made in the brain. Yeah. And the third process that's really important is that the sense of ego identity, and I'm not saying ego identity is a bad thing, it's just like it's part of the story, but it's not the whole story. But the sense of ego identity gets turned down. Now, this is the state that we are aiming for very often with any way of changing awareness. Yeah, this is the thing that we're really interested in, because the default mode network state, the state that most of us are in most of the time, particularly kind of, Euro-American, relatively atomized cultures where we spend, compared to many civilizations, an amazing amount of time just on our own, many of us, that this state needs to be balanced up with an engagement with these other states of awareness. So those other states of awareness happen spontaneously through things like dreaming. They can happen at various points in our lives, but being able to kind of induce those things is really important because it brings us into the moment and into the now, and it kind of decouples us, at least temporarily, from worrying about the past and the future. One of the things that psychedelic drugs do is they have one of their effects is to make people very, very present in what's actually unfolding for them in that moment. And that, depending on what their circumstances are, what their environment is, what their emotional state is like, that could be very positive or more challenging or whatever. But the point is, it puts you into this moment here and now. And so that's a broad sort of way of thinking about the relationship between the normal everyday consciousness that we have and these altered states of awareness. And I would argue that being able to kind of flow between these things is actually what's really helpful and healthy for people. That's why psychedelic drugs, if you look at the work that's being done with veterans in the United States using MDMA to address post-traumatic stress disorder, that's exactly the model that's being used. The model is that you use this psychedelic substance, it brings you into this relationship with the now, it allows you to step outside of the default mode network story that you tell yourself, I'm a person with trauma. And it doesn't stop there being trauma, but it allows you to see it in a very different context, in a very different light. And then when you return to normal awareness, let's call it, then that healing opportunity, that way of seeing things from this very, very different point of view, allows the altered state to become an altered trait, an altered behavior. And that's what makes a real difference. Does that make sense?
It does. It's interesting, and I think it's amazing that being present actually has to be an altered state, because you'd think that that's what our default would be, but it really isn't, is it?
No, and it kind of makes sense really because we're these hominid simian creatures. We spend a lot of time, understandably and arguably rightly, but thinking about where are we in the social hierarchy and where are we within the storyline. Yeah, so we spend a lot of time going, I wonder what I did, last week, and I wonder what I'm going to do next week, and I wonder what my, how so and so thinks about me, or how this person considers me, or what do I think about this person. So we spend a lot of time asking ourselves, what is it that we think? Now it's interesting because one might make an argument, and I've heard this suggested, that in other cultural settings, let's imagine, let's cut back, 30,000 years, we're all hunter-gatherers. But in a hunter-gatherer community where you're within a social network of about 200 individuals, so that's the average size of a tribal group, and probably spending some of your time within an even smaller, familial group or a couple of different families, and you're spending your time being very, very hyper aware of your environment. Yeah, so where the food sources are, what the cues for the animals are, where water courses are, and so on. Now, it may well be that in those situations, the default network is the network of being present in the now. Yeah, that would kind of make sense. And perhaps, this is only a conjecture, but perhaps the experience of domestication, the advent of farming, complex civilization, atomization and changes in familial relationships, the bigger expansion of social groups beyond that 200, which is about a manageable collection. You can easily remember 200 people's names. Beyond that, it starts to be a problem. So maybe our default mode network state now is the default, like that is to say, the common state for the mind. But that's because when we do the research, we say, well, how do we measure what the baseline of the mind is? And we put people in an fMRI scanner on their own, and we get them to not say anything. And arguably, that's not what a human is meant to do. A human is meant to be in community with others. And in community with others, we're much more in the now. So as I'm having this conversation with you, and we're talking, we're chatting, I haven't got this scripted. And what will probably happen is that, we're going through time, and I look back and I go, oh, wow, it's 20 minutes already. Fantastic. I mean, I didn't, it feels really quick because we're involved in this kind of interpersonal flow. So maybe the default state, the default mode network state, is only default mode network from the point of view of like Western kind of atomized civilization. Maybe if you'd gone to someone who was a hunter-gatherer, they would have looked at this state of awareness where you're sitting on your own thinking about stuff and said, well, we do that in Vision Quest, but basically we don't, we're always hanging out with each other and trying to figure out what the animals and the plants and the water and the weather is doing. Yeah. So the state of being in the moment, we feel that that's like an exception. Yeah, that's an unusual state. That's something we have to work for. Perhaps in other cultural settings that's different. I don't know.
I think as a hunter-gatherer culture, if you looked back maybe 10,000 years, I don't think that an altered state would have been that unusual, because you would have a hunter-gatherer who maybe a male who was scanning the landscape for hours and hours on end, and breathing differently than we do now, and experiencing things that we've never experienced. I think that altered state would have come with that natural vision, and not actually a vision quest, correct?
Yeah, quite possibly. I mean, I was doing some meditation yesterday morning, I think it was, and afterwards I was kind of reflecting on this, and I was reflecting on, okay, so here I am, I'm meditating. So the basic meditation is there's a couple of different flavors, but the flavor that I was trying was, which is a common practice for me, which is to have an anchor. So the sensation of breath, or the movement of the air over the upper lip, and you basically bring attention to that. Attention wanders, because attention wanders, that's the way it goes. You notice that attention has wandered, and you bring it back to the anchor, to the breath. And I was kind of thinking about this afterwards, and thinking it's really interesting that what I do is I find my thoughts kind of going off in different directions, and then I bring them back to the anchor. And of course, that's what I need to do. That's how meditation works. That's basically meditation 101. There's plenty more to say, but the core of it is that. But I was considering what would be my experience if I was say a hunter 10,000 years ago. Let's give it that kind of time frame. And I'm in a landscape, and I'm waiting to see whether or not the deer are coming through. So I might find that my mind is wandering, of course, but I'm going to have to be like really primed, really attentive. So I don't want to kind of go into myself. I don't want to be wrapped up in my own narrative, thinking about like, oh, maybe I shouldn't have said such and such a thing around the campfire last night, or maybe when the rains come, then I'll do this with my partner, or whatever. I want to be very kind of present in that now moment. So yeah, maybe it's the case that, a hunter-gatherer community, without wanting to do the whole noble savage thing, a hunter-gatherer community would probably find that what we consider unusual altered states, they will have certainly wouldn't use that kind of language. They wouldn't go, well, this is the weird outlier, strange thing. They'd probably say, well, this is just like normal thinking. The weird outlier state is the state where you're kind of on your own, just considering your own narrative. That would be the curious thing, I suspect.
Let's consider a psychedelic course 101. What are the substances or entheogens that are naturally occurring in the United States that provide an altered state of consciousness for a potential experiencer?
Okay, so the United States is an interesting case, because obviously we have recent changes, as I understand it, in legislation in places like Oakland and Denver and various other jurisdictions, where the term that you use, entheogens, so plants that or substances that allow us to generate or contact or be perceive the sacred within us, yeah, as opposed to psychedelic, another perfectly legitimate term, which is substances that allow us to manifest, that is to say, to become aware of the mechanisms of our own minds, both perfectly reasonable words. In the United States, changes in legislation means that depending on exactly where you are, there are a number of substances which are available. I mean, growing native in the Americas, of course, are the phenethylamine substances, so things like peyote, San Pedro, cactus, which contain as their primary alkaloid mescaline, so a modified psychedelic amphetamine, so something that is a psychedelic, that is to say, it gives a whole variety of different effects, which are often in a Western context described as kind of visionary in some sense, and also quite kind of stimulating. Again, growing native in the landscape in the Americas, we're talking about things like psilocybin mushrooms. Psilocybin mushrooms are one of the other great family of psychedelics. So you have the phenethylamine family, the mescaline family, and the second family are the tryptamine family. And psilocybin, which is derived from magic mushrooms, from psychedelic mushrooms, from psilocybin mushrooms, that's a tryptamine. And then there's like a whole bunch of other plants out there. I mean, you know, in the Americas in particular, if we take North and South America together, very, very great diversity of naturally occurring psychedelics. And then, of course, pretty much since, let's call it the early 20th century, and particularly since the mid-20th century, we've got the emergence of a number of synthetically derived psychedelics, still with organic roots, because that's the way it goes. So things like MDMA, things like substances such as ketamine, and of course, most notably, I suppose, within the American story, LSD, which when it came into particularly culture in North America, made huge impact on the culture to the extent where it led to Nixon's war on drugs. So there's a whole bunch of stuff out there, both growing in the locality, and take aside cannabis. I mean, cannabis, in my view, is a psychedelic, and people who think that it's not psychedelic, I think probably just haven't had enough of it, or haven't taken it orally, which, you know, is a powerful experience potentially. So there are plants out there with these substances in, and there are laboratory made ones. One, of course, has to be very thoughtful about the legal framework in which those things are happening. I would imagine that if you're in Oakland, it's a very different story to being in, I don't know, Alabama or somewhere. I don't know the details of the North American story.
Can you explain some of these substances and their effect on the body and the brain and what we could experience by using them?
Let's imagine that you decide, where it's arguably safe and legal to do so, that you want to take something like psilocybin. So psilocybin has been being used by humans, and probably hominids before we were even anatomically modern humans. It's incredibly safe. That's the first thing to say. When you talk about drugs, people always understandably worry about overdose and addiction. And psilocybin is incredibly safe. So let's go with psilocybin. You know, you couldn't physically eat enough mushrooms to kill you. It just wouldn't happen. You know, the lethal dose would be something like 10 pounds of mushrooms dropped on you from a 13th story window. You know, ain't no way you're going to die with this stuff. It might make you feel like something very powerful and profound is happening, but it's not going to kill you. So let's take psilocybin. So psilocybin is a tryptamine, as I mentioned earlier, and that means that when you put it into a human, and there's a whole cascade of different things that happen. So although sometimes the psilocybin experience might be stimulating, so we might feel like getting up and moving or dancing, and at other times it might be sedating, so we might feel like lying down and being all dreamy. The most important thing about it is that it creates new connections within the mind. And so those new connections, to take a really simple example, can be connections that previously didn't exist between the optic centers in the brain and, say, the centers associated with hearing. So, for example, if you're listening to music and you close your eyes, you might see all sorts of beautiful patterns, typically the kind of fractal patterns that you might see on a, say, computer visualizer screen. those kind of fractal patterns will emerge, and they will somehow feel that they connected with the music. And as the music changes, the patterns may change as well. So we can have these visionary experiences. And often, though, there will be a sense that these patterns have a meaning associated with them, that they're trying to kind of tell you something or convey something. Sometimes the closed eye imagery might resolve itself into people or scenes, somewhat like a dream, really. And a tryptamine experience in the say psilocybin, you'd be looking at something which, on an empty stomach, if you take an appropriate dose of mushrooms, you'll feel some sort of effect within about 20 minutes after ingestion. And then the experience will gradually kind of increase. There is a sense of coming up or coming into the trip or getting high. So there's a sense of almost like an acceleration. And then you're into the experience, and then the experience might last for perhaps 3 or 4 hours, something like this, and then gradually fades out. So a simple way of explaining it would be, if you were lying there in a suitable environment with your eyes closed and you're looking into the darkness, it might be as though after the first 20 minutes, you start to have a sense that you're not looking into just black, you're looking into kind of a space, like looking at the night sky. And then you might find that after that, a little more time elapses, that night sky begins to resolve itself into beautiful, dreamlike images or scenes. And very often, although we talk about the visionary side of these kinds of things, what's kind of more important in a way is that there are these feelings that arise. So there's a sense of, there can be senses of connection is the primary one. So as the brain is connecting itself to bits it doesn't normally talk to, there is also often a sense of connection between the self and, for example, if you're in a natural environment, if you're outside or in a park or in some other beautiful setting, you're sat around a fire or something, there'll be a sense that the boundary between self and other is destabilized, just like the boundary between sight and hearing is destabilized in the brain. So what happens is there's a sense that you're connected with everything else. Perhaps you're connected with those other people, maybe you're connected with the other life forms that are there, the trees, the plants, the insects, the animals. What you have to be thoughtful of with all these things is that these substances are tremendously, the most important thing about this is they're very, very highly influenced by what is usually described as set and setting. So the set is the mindset with which you go into the experience. So if you go into the experience feeling, you might feel excited, you might feel trepidation, you might feel a number of things. But if you've just gone through some kind of terribly traumatic event and it's very fresh in your mind, chances are that will be a key part of the experience. And that may be okay if you're well organized for it, but probably not. So you need to be in a good space, a good mindset from which to make this adventure. Just like if you were to go on holiday. You can go on holiday having had a terrible argument with your partner and having found that the plumbing has gone wrong in the house and so on. But probably you'll carry that with you into your holiday, and it will ruin your holiday, or at least make it not as good. If, however, you leave the house thinking, hey, it's all good, I'm really set up for this, yes, I'm a bit nervous, I'm a bit excited, but it's going to be fine, that attitude carried into the experience is more likely to allow it to unfold positively. The other side of the equation is the setting. So you have the set, the mindset, and then the setting, the environment in which the experience unfolds. So that needs to be supportive, safe, consensual, with maybe, if you're unfamiliar with this and you've never explored this territory before, you might want to have a guide or a sitter or a friend or however you want, whatever language you want to put around it, someone to help you out who maybe knows this territory a bit. If you're going into a ceremonial setting, you want to be comfortable with, all the people involved in that and the kind of the kind of style that the ceremony is going to be in. You want to be in a good environment, and depending again on things like the dosage you're taking. If you're taking a higher dose, you can be quite happily just like lying down in a safe and secure room. If perhaps you're taking a lower dose or towards the end of an experience, you might want to go out and be in nature, because that sense of connection, which many of these substances provoke for people, is of course tremendously strong when your setting is actually out in a natural environment. So those are the kind of variables that you have to be thinking about. You have to be thinking about, like, what am I bringing into this experience? What's my set? What's my mindset? And that can include things like intention. Am I doing this for a particular reason? Am I doing this for some sort of healing process? Am I doing it in order to get some creative insight? Am I doing it just to explore? Nothing necessarily wrong in that. But what am I bringing into this experience? And then where's it going to unfold? Am I making sure that I've got a safe, nourishing, good environment to work within? If you were taking, say, psilocybin, you might find that you might want access, for example, to art materials, so you could draw or paint. You might want different types of music to explore. You might want to have the opportunity to, just kind of change any number of the variables in your environment. The light level, all these things. Typically, psilocybin, often low light levels are what most people tend to favour. Because that allows the visionary stuff to kind of unfold more easily. And of course, you have to consider all the kind of health and safety dosage information. And luckily, we're in an age where there's a vast amount of material available online. Much of it is very, very good. And by cross-checking a few different sources, even if you're kind of unfamiliar with this territory, you can probably make a pretty good kind of estimation of how you should proceed. Ain't nothing as good as actually getting somebody who knows the territory, who you trust and you feel comfortable with, to assist with whatever your experience is. And of course, we're getting to the point now increasingly where there are many settings where we've got licensed and legal environments for people to take psychedelics. So here in Britain, where I am, plenty of people go out to licensed or at least kind of, I suppose we'd call it, if not necessarily licensed, then at least legally acceptable psilocybin retreats and work with people over in, say, the Netherlands, where some forms of psychedelic mushroom are permitted. So it's about finding the right kind of storyline for you, but being really mindful about this idea of setting and substance. What are you bringing to the experience? Where's it going to happen? And what is it you're going to take? So in the example of psilocybin that I've just given, it's a very, very predictable, it's a very, very safe kind of trajectory in terms of the onset of the substance, the basic way it works and so on, but it can tremendously vary depending on how much psilocybin you're taking and how you feel and where you're taking it. And so it's not just about the drug. And that's a really important thing about psychedelics, is that when we talk about psychedelics, we're talking about stuff, substances, things made in plants or alchemist laboratories. But really, we need to be talking about all of those variables. It's the context in which those things happen that matters.
Other than cannabis, are there substances available in the U.S., Canada, and the UK that are actually legal that you can obtain easily?
Well, you see, the legal thing is always kind of interesting, and although it seems like a minor point, it's important perhaps to point out that none of the substances are ever illegal, only people's use in relation to them. So you can be a licensed LSD researcher in, Texas, and have a license to use LSD. LSD is not inherently illegal, it's whether or not you're licensed to use it. You're permitted by the state to use those things. And so in North America, you'd have to really look at the kind of the laws in those particular areas. I know obviously that laws with regard to cannabis have changed quite dramatically, and laws are changing as regards things like psilocybin, peyote, and so on. There are exclusions and variations. So, for example, in North America, since the end of the 19th century, the Native American Church have been permitted to use peyote as part of their ceremony. And peyote contains, amongst other things, mescaline, which is a Class A in the UK, Schedule 1 in the United States, prohibited substance, or more rightly, most people are not allowed to use it unless you are, a bona fide member of the Native American Church. So it would be, I can't really kind of make broad brushstroke suggestions about situations which are tremendously variable and seem to be changing quite quickly. You know, the war on drugs that we had from Richard Nixon's time onwards is if not over, then at least it's in retreat, because we realise that as far as psychedelics are concerned, there are tremendous benefits to be had from these substances. And as far as things like opiates, heroin, fentanyl, and stimulants, you know, cocaine and amphetamines, methamphetamine are concerned, making those things illegal just didn't work. In fact, arguably, it just made organised crime more successful and gave people more dirty money, and more violence was visited on people with serious problems. So these things are becoming, you know, more understood as medical issues and social issues than just trying to, you know, put our fingers in our ears and pretend that they don't exist. But as far as psychedelics are concerned, I guess it would be a question for people to look at their own setting and find out what's permitted, what's not, and also to recognise that just because something is against the law doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. You know, I think it was a noted American president who said something to that effect about people having that they actively should break the law if the law is wrong. So whilst I wouldn't necessarily want to be encouraging people to do so, I would say to people that what they have to do is to consider their situation and consider what it is that they want to achieve and whether or not they can do that in what they feel is a good way. So you have to kind of look around. You have to be aware of the context in the same way that you have to be aware of the setting for the psychedelic adventure.
I know there's a lot of different answers for this question, but I want you to talk about what could be considered a bad trip, how can dosage prevent that, and how can research prevent that? I know that varies to different substances, but is there an answer for that? Yeah,
I mean, Cam, it's a bit like any of these experiences. You know, are they good or bad? I mean, that's a binary choice, and life is more complicated than that, isn't it? Really, I mean, you know, here you are with, or here one is, perhaps you, with an alien encounter experience, which at the time you might think, oh my God, this is completely terrifying. And then 5 years down the line, you might think, well, actually, that showed me a whole bunch of important stuff. So whether or not we consider something good or bad is highly variable over time. Generally speaking, I would say that by good management of setting and substance, you can allow for even challenging experiences to unfold in a good way. All right. So I'll give you an example from the book that I wrote about this, Getting Higher. And it was actually an example that I gave to my eldest son. He said, well, what's the big deal about LSD? I don't understand, you know, why is it illegal? And I said, well, you know, there are various issues associated with it. One of them is that you can take LSD with a bunch of friends in a really good environment when you're in a really good space psychologically, and you can say, hey, look at all the little faces in the trees. And you can take exactly the same substance under less good circumstances with people who are not good people, and you can say in a terrified voice, look at all the little faces in the trees. And the difference between the two things is not the substance primarily. It's primarily to do with how you feel in yourself and how that environment is. So by managing those things, you can create a situation where you are less likely to have a bad time. Now, the power of the psychedelic experience is that because it makes these new connections in the brain, sometimes those connections can be problematic or difficult or challenging, or whatever language we want to use, because it brings up stuff, you know, personal relationships. I mean, it brings up things like, I don't know, the ending of a difficult relationship, right? That's part of, if that's part of your story, then it's quite possible that the psychedelic will bring that up, because it's like churning. It's like kind of, it's rather like, what's the analogy? Like stirring the cauldron of the unconscious mind. Stuff's going to come up that's going to be tricky. But if you are in a good place and you're in a reasonably positive mind state, and if you also, when I say a good place, that maybe includes someone to help support you with what's going on, you can have that difficult stuff and it can come up and you can look at it and go, oh, that's difficult stuff. Yeah, I can see the problem here. But because you're seeing it from a different point of view, as long as you can find ways of kind of letting that go, and then moving on to whatever the next process is, then that's fine. And usually the ways of letting that stuff go are actually relatively straightforward. They are, if you're in a difficult space and all this content is coming up in the mind that is unpleasant, because the psychedelic mind is so easily influenced, all you probably need to do is change what music you've got playing, or open the window, or wrap yourself in a blanket, or speak a few words, or have your friend who's supporting you offer you some water with a smile. Yeah, just that will do. So this thing about like good trips, bad trips, firstly, it depends on where you stand as to whether or not an experience is good or bad. And secondly, if you are going to have challenging experiences, the psychedelic state will almost certainly involve those. Even if you're very familiar with it, the experience of, as your mind starts to go into this altered state, that's unnerving, that's weird. Yeah, and the adrenaline happens in your body and your body goes, whoa, what's going on? But getting through that state and getting an opportunity to engage with the difficult things that pretty much all of us have in our lives, we're human beings, we experience suffering, to engage with those things in a way that is whole or good, or again, whatever language you kind of favor with this sort of stuff, it's usually about making sure that you're in a good environment and that you've entered that experience in a good and positive frame of mind. Yeah. Stuff's always going to go wrong. There are always going to be problems or whatever. But again, I would suggest that if people are new to this territory, just like anything else, you go gently. Yeah. When you first meet someone, you shake them by the hand and speak politely to them. It's only after knowing them from a while that you'll kind of embrace them and give them a big hug and kiss. So same with psychedelics. When you take a psychedelic for the first time, if it feels like the right thing to do and with appropriate advice, take a lower dose. Yeah. If you take a lower dose of psilocybin, so synthetic psilocybin, 10 milligrams, or in terms of some of the mushrooms that I know, cubensis mushrooms, which grow, for example, in the United States, something like 1 or 2 grams, and you'll experience part of that and you'll get to know it. Yeah. Because part of the whole shamanic thing with this stuff is that these substances are rather, they can be thought of very, very easily as spirits, as entities, as beings. And whether or not, however we believe that may or may not exist, approaching them like you would respectfully, like a new friend, is often a good strategy. So you can take a lower dose in a good, safe, supportive environment, see how it goes. You can always add, you can always take a subsequent experience and explore the territory kind of further. So I would suggest with people that don't worry about stopping having a bad trip. It's not about that. It's more to do with cultivating a good, supportive environment internally and externally, so that when challenging content arises, because it will, because that's part of what you're aiming for, because that's how healing and insight happens. When challenging content arises, you're in a good place to address that. That's what really matters, at least in my view.
So if you adjust dosages, do your research, and kind of do a buddy system where you have a support group behind you, is there still ever a danger of entering some sort of consciousness where you could experience dangers that are beyond our world that aren't even expected?
I would say that it's an interesting thing, isn't it? I mean, when we talk about something like, I don't know, ayahuasca, for example, is probably the kind of go-to instance of this, which in many settings in which people take it has a strong kind of spirit model. Yeah, so a strong idea that the ayahuasca is a spirit, it's grandmother ayahuasca and its teacher and so on, and you'll encounter entities and so on. Most of the time, I would say that those entities, whether or not we think of them as psychological constructs, or that they exist in like some sort of interpersonal realm, or they exist in some sort of other reality, kind of doesn't really matter. Yeah. So can you end up in a situation where you encounter some terrible thing that might do you damage? Well, potentially yes, I suppose you would have to say that. but that's much more likely to, but anything that you encounter is held by the environment in which you're in. So I'll give you an example. So I think on the second time I took ayahuasca, I had an experience where I met in the vision. So here I am, I'm in the vision. I've taken a dose of ayahuasca, a couple of doses, and I had this experience of seeing this terrifying. If I give you the example of the second time I took ayahuasca. So in the inner world, in my vision, I was in a jungle. I was in this sort of beautiful South American jungle, and there was this fantastic, beautiful woman, black woman with feathers in her hair, the most gorgeous and fabulous goddess. And she came over to me, and then she started to defecate on me. She started to basically shit out all of the bad things, all of the times I've ever been mean, all of the times I've ever not stood up for people, including myself, all of the shame that I had in my life at that stage, and just being a human, that's kind of stuff that we carry with us. I do. I imagine other people do. Now, that was a really traumatic experience, but what then happened in the vision was that I was, I was there in a ceremonial space with other people, and I was able to go through that experience to the point where what she then did was she scooped out like my stomach, it was the only way to describe it, my abdomen, and lit a fire in it, and then that burnt away all this stuff. So it didn't stop the fact that I might have been mean to my sisters when I was a kid, and I kind of regretted that, but it meant that I'd gone through this kind of transformative experience. Now, had I not have been in a good environment, and had I not been working with some other ayahuasca practitioners, somebody might have intervened and gone, oh no, you're having a terrible time. You're having a horrible vision of something. Why don't you kind of open your eyes and do something else and whatever? And actually what I needed to do was to sit there and get to the next stage where she did this purification ritual, if you like, with me. Yeah. So I would imagine that had someone pulled me out of that experience at the moment when the shit got real, as it were, and I found myself literally covered in my own kind of shame and my own sadness and the things that I'd done wrong, I might have found myself at the other end of the experience going, oh, actually, I've come out of this feeling really bad and unresolved, and there's no catharsis and so on. So because these are powerful experiences, it's important to have them in a good setting, yeah? And the way that is for a particular individual can be hugely variable. For some people, ritual setting is exactly what they want. For other people, they'll want a more contemporary therapeutic setting. And that's fine. There's a lot of different ways of doing this and going through that process. Does that make sense?
It does.
Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's absolutely.
So really, it's about not intervening too soon, letting the process happen, right, but doing it in a good and supportive way. Sorry.
I think it's absolutely true that antidepressants are a substance that alter consciousness. Are there any psychedelics out there that can be used during our normal day-to-day routine, maybe as an alternative? And I'm not asking you to make medical or making a medical
Sure.
opinion, but there's always alternatives, I think.
Okay, so there's two things that really come to mind with that question. One of them, I suppose, is the current vogue that exists for things like microdosing psychedelics. So I'm sure that lots of listeners will have heard about people in Silicon Valley microdosing. That is to say, taking basically sub-perceptual amounts of, say, LSD, because the theory runs that this connection of different bits of the brain might be able to help things like creativity. It might allow things like us to be less susceptible to depression and so on, and that those effects might happen even when we take doses that are so low that we kind of don't notice that we've taken anything. Yeah. Now, there's a lot of debate at the moment within the psychedelic and scientific community as to how effective these things are. They definitely work for some people, but whether or not that's primarily a placebo effect or whether or not it's pharmacological is kind of open to debate. But one possibility for people is to look at this idea of microdosing. So for a number of people, they find that microdosing psychedelics, taking low sub-perceptual levels of these substances, And there are various models, taking a tiny amount of, say, psilocybin every 3 or 4 days, something like this, for a period of time, tracking how that works, seeing if it's effective. That's a model. That's one way of doing it. The other way of thinking about it is about how certainly the more full-blown psychedelic experience, so the kind of thing that I was being a research participant on in January of this year. Now, the idea of that is it's a treatment for treatment-resistant depression. So here are people who, in the next few years, will be going through that program. In fact, they're doing the research now with people with a diagnosis of depression. Those people will be taking all sorts of serotonin reuptake inhibitors and various types of antidepressant medications, which most of them basically don't work terribly well for most people most of the time. So they are, a lot of them are kind of 20, 30 years old, and it's very debatable about how effectively these things work. The idea is that what you would do instead is you would take people off that medication for a couple of weeks, and then you would use a higher dose psilocybin experience, but you would wrap that around with a whole bunch of talk-based therapy. So it's not just a question of like bunging a bunch of psilocybin or MDMA into someone's brain and then that fixes it. What you have to do is you have to really think about the set and setting again. So to give an example, I've got a friend, Ben Sesso, who's one of the leading people, certainly in Britain, doing work with MDMA to address alcoholism. And he gives people MDMA as part of this whole therapeutic process, which includes a number of sessions which are kind of talking about the issues, talking about how people feel, how did their alcoholism arise, what's their backstory, blah, blah, blah. Then doing these psychedelic sessions where the person, and this is one of the important bits, the person does their own healing. Like Ben sits there and supports them and helps them and offers them water if they want it. But basically, the psychedelic therapist, like the shaman, doesn't actually do very much while the substance is happening for that individual. But then afterwards, they talk to them and they help them integrate that experience into their daily life. So the question, are there other substances you can use to address things like depression? Yes, there are 2 ways you can do it with psychedelics. Number one is the model of microdosing. So the idea that you take a low level of psychedelic and that perhaps that has some beneficial effect. Model 2, which we know definitely works, is that you enter a therapeutic program which involves a number of sessions of talking about whatever the issue is, then going into the psychedelic state where you're taken out of the rut, out of the default mode network, out of that inability to see beyond your own intrusive thoughts or your own depression or whatever it is. You get a chance to see everything from a new perspective, and then the opportunity to kind of integrate that into your life with other talk-based processes, which mean that basically you don't need the meds anymore. Yeah, that's the way it works. If you look at, so the FDA in the United States has just approved MDMA as a breakthrough therapy for post-traumatic stress disorder. The statistics on it, if you look at, there's an organization called MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. Their work covered on stage things like Fox News, working with American veterans. Their work shows really clearly that you can enter a program with treatment-resistant PTSD. Yeah, so you've tried everything else. So the PTSD you've got is so bad that basically nothing works. And that 4 years after that process of going through the MDMA psychotherapy, 67% of participants do not meet the criteria for diagnosis with PTSD. So not only do they have less of it, they don't have it at all, 67%. And then another, I think it's like something like 20%, have significantly improved response to their post-traumatic stress disorder. It's no longer considered to be a critical high level, and maybe it can be addressed with either follow-up sessions or it can be addressed with other types of therapy. So really, in terms of can we find other ways of dealing with depression? Yes, microdosing is an option. The other option is proper psychedelic therapy, which means that you can just come off this stuff and you don't need it anymore. And the FDA recognized that. And certainly there's a parallel process happening in a lot of places in Europe. Psychedelics are powerful and they were made illegal in terms of most people's ability to use them, because they are powerful, because they are that significant, and they are capable of changing the way that we are as individuals, and arguably the way that we are as a society. So the fact that they're kind of returning into a context where, like if you look at the World Health Organization, they say that depression is the number one leading cause of misery on our planet. Yeah, so it's no longer heart disease, cancer, it's not even malnutrition, it's depression. We as a species are depressed. And it's interesting to note that Euro-American, white, predominantly white culture, we haven't had access to the psychedelic state for a long time. It's not been part of our culture. Yeah, we just haven't had it. It's, you know, we've had a culture that's based on alcohol, tobacco, cocaine, opium, tea, coffee, all stimulants and depressants, no psychedelics. And we are also the culture that's led the world in creating an epidemic of depression. And so perhaps these medicines and their return might be really, really useful, particularly at a time of great ecological crisis, because the fact that these experiences allow us to feel connection with aspects of ourselves, so the trauma that we experience, with each other and with the biosphere, you know, it might, as they say, not be a moment too soon, given the way that our society is unfolding.
I think it's interesting that the other side of the coin, you have depression, and then you have inflammation, and there's a lot of things like cannabis that have been researched that can solve both of those things at the same time simultaneously.
And interestingly, there is it's only really starting to happen now, because primarily with psychedelics, the overriding thing is that you take them and you go, wow, this has changed the way my mind works and the way my senses work in a big way. And so we're mostly interested in that. But it's also the case that there's now research looking at, so physiologically, what do these things do? The interesting thing about LSD, psilocybin, and all the rest of them is they don't actually do very much. They work on a particular a primary receptor in the brain, and some secondary receptors, but they don't seem to do much else, except it turns out that a number of those processes have anti-inflammatory effects. So to really kind of simplify the thing down, there's you've probably heard of serotonin. So serotonin is the it's the neurotransmitter associated with resting, digesting, calming, relaxation, satisfaction, all those things. This is to massively simplify the storyline. But broadly speaking, it's true that psychedelics work on this system. So MDMA, for instance, which is the most obvious one, it's called ecstasy. Yes, it can be ecstatic, but it's also deeply calming. It reduces the amount of fear that we have, which is why people can talk about their problematic or their traumatic experiences while they're on it. And that sense of calming and relaxing and the reduction of fear, unsurprisingly, just like with cannabis, what that does is it reduces inflammation. And there are now increasingly bits of research looking at psychedelics and saying, do you know what? It's really interesting that they have these anti-inflammatory properties as a group of substances. And there are a number of different mechanisms by which they work, but yeah, the psychedelic state, in a way, the subjective psychedelic state, the things we experience in our minds, down at a neurological level, what you've got connection, you've got opening up, you've got relaxation, you've got this de-armoring of the body. So rather than us holding ourselves tight, which is what we mostly spend a lot of our time doing, you know, there you are in your business suit going into the meeting, you know, what's the mindset in that? What's the attitude that you're having to express in those sorts of moments? But that kind of relaxation, opening, calming, connecting psychological state is mirrored physiologically in what's happening with the body. Yeah, so you're totally right. So the that ability to reduce inflammation and reducing depression, I mean, arguably they are they're two symptoms of the same problem. Yeah, which is to do with this sense of tight, knotted, paranoid about the rest of what's going on in the world, fearful response, which unfortunately is a set of responses that as industrialized Euro-American folks, that's a lot of how our political leaders, even if they don't consciously like us to be in that state, it's much easier to manipulate a bunch of humans when they're in that state. When they're in a kind of more open-minded, critical, but also wide-ranging and calm and centered state of mind, arguably they are one might say more problematic, depending if you have a kind of totalitarian approach to the way your politics unfolds. But certainly at a personal level, yeah, they're anti-inflammatory, they're antidepressants. They are very powerful medicines.
Julian, where do we get it? Is there a safe way to procure psychedelics?
Again, you have to look at what your setting is. You have to look at what your situation is. You have to look at okay, so am I in a situation where I can get along to a Native American church ceremony? Am I in a situation where I can find reliable, good people, where I can learn how to identify psychedelic mushrooms, and I can go out and I can either grow them myself or I can forage for them successfully? Can I travel to a place where I know I can go on a legitimate retreat? Again, you've got to be really, really thoughtful about this stuff, and there's no simple answer. It does depend very much on the context, and it's problematic because there are some of these substances are legislated against in the strongest of possible terms, despite the fact that the number of people killed by any of these things is vanishingly small compared to over-the-counter medications and prescriptions, and certainly alcohol and tobacco. So I think it's a question of finding the way that's going to work for you in the context that you're in, and a lot of that is about kind of research, making connections with other members of the psychedelic community, not just as drug dealers, but as people who are going to be able to advise you as to what's the best way for me to be able to make these explorations. I think that the psychedelic state is also available to us through non-drug mechanisms. So the easiest one to do is breath work. So Stanislav Grof, when researcher, psychologist, psychotherapist, when he was doing his work with LSD, when he got to the point where LSD was no longer an option for him because he didn't have a license to use it, he developed a technique called breath work. And connected breath work or holotropic breath work is basically just breathing faster and deeper than normal, without any lock in the breath, without any stops in the breathing. And you can induce a powerful visionary state of awareness just with breath. I would recommend, there's a book called Life Force by David Lee, published by Universe Machine, which is one of the ways of got a whole bunch of these techniques in them. But essentially, go onto YouTube, have a look at breath work, because breath work techniques haven't been legislated against, and that's a really easy way of exploring the psychedelic state, which is immediately available to everybody right here, right now.
Is your book Getting Higher a beginner's guide?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it's designed really for people who maybe have got the other side of the problem, so that they've got some of whatever the substance is. They've got access through the dark web or through a friend or through growing or finding a psychedelic, but they don't necessarily have access to a person or a community of people who can help them look at setting and substance. So the idea of Getting Higher was kind of a book which I sort of wish that I'd had 20, 30 years ago, something like this myself. It's hopefully something that will be useful for psychonauts, people who are already familiar with this territory, but also people who are kind of coming into it new, and maybe kind of confused by the panoply of different words and names and ideas and stuff that's around. So I hope it is quite an accessible guide for people. It's certainly written in language which I'm told I've been successful in that, in terms of trying to make it simple and easy for people to understand, and to then use that to inform their own practice, however that's going to be.
What's coming up next for you, and where can we find you online?
Okay, so next thing I'm going to be doing is teaching a workshop in London on psychedelic magic. That's next weekend And that's, again, using non-drug orientated techniques, so things like drumming and sound and breathwork and so on. So I teach fairly frequently. I do teaching and mentoring online. Easiest place to find me is my blog, which is theblogofbaphomet.com. And if you have a little look, there's a section over there on at the top of the blog called Deep Magic, and you can check out all the various events and things that myself and my partner Nikki Weird are involved in doing. So that's probably the best place to look up what we're up to.
Julian Vayne has been my guest tonight, and his book is Getting Higher, a manual for exploring the use of psychedelic substances in the context of spirituality, self-transformation, and magic. Julian, I'd like you to give our listeners the final word tonight.
Cameron, I'd just like to say thank you very much for inviting me onto the show, and I hope very much that our listeners to the show find some of this stuff interesting, maybe find ways to understand the journey that perhaps their friends are on, or to find their own journey with these altered states of awareness, however they access them. And I would encourage them to stay high and stay free.
Getting Higher, written by Julian Vayne. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
My Alien Life Podcast.
You can find my website at www.myalienlifepodcast.com, and please subscribe to my latest downloads at iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, and at podbean.com. And please follow me and like me on Facebook and Twitter. My Alien Life is written and produced for broadcast at Studio 254 in the Northern Rocky Mountains. The music you are hearing is produced and created by Elion. You can find all Elion's work online at Heart Dance Records.